There's a tax benefit almost every retiree has heard of. 0% capital gains, right? The idea that if your income is low enough, that you can then sell appreciated investments and pay no tax on the gain. And of course, it's real. I mean, it's not a loophole. It's right there in the tax code. But what we're going to focus on here today is what people oftentimes don't understand about it, and specifically why one couple got a surprise tax bill on gains that they assumed would be tax-free. Tom was 64, Linda was 63. Now, these are not their real names, by the way, but the numbers here are real. So they had retired about 8 months earlier with just over $1.2 million. And they had a mix of IRAs and also a taxable brokerage account. Now, they hadn't claimed Social Security yet. And so to cover their living expenses, Linda had a pension of $21,600 a year. And then they were also pulling $84,000 from their IRA. So $7,000 a month from the IRA was coming out. Now, they were intentionally drawing from the IRA, partly to cover expenses, but also to reduce the balance before RMDs kicked in down the road, which is a reasonable strategy. But here's the thing, what they didn't account for was how that IRA withdrawal would interact with the capital gain that they were about to realize here. So their situation, their total income was $105,600. Their marginal tax bracket was 12%. Now, they also had, without realizing it, about $25,500 of room left before they had hit the top of the 0% capital gains bracket. Now, that number matters, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. So last fall, they decided to rebalance their brokerage account. Some positions they held for years, the market had done well, and it just kind of felt like a reasonable time to go in there and just kind of clean some things up, do some rebalancing. Now, they weren't selling because they needed the money for living expenses. Remember that they had the pension and the IRA withdrawals covering that. This was purely a portfolio decision. And so they sold $80,000 of appreciated investments, some of which was individual stocks, some ETFs also that they had held for years. And since they'd owned them for more than a year, all $80,000 qualified as long-term capital gains. Now, that distinction matters, right? Because long-term capital gains qualify for the preferential capital gains rates. Short-term gains, on the other hand, these are on investments that you hold for less than a year, and these get taxed as ordinary income, just like an IRA withdrawal does. Now, for these folks, because they had read about the 0% capital gains rate, they thought they were in good shape. And that confidence there is exactly what makes this kind of surprise really quite common. I mean, a lot of people think that the gain is its own separate calculation and that it's independent of everything else that they earned that year. And that assumption is where things went wrong for them. So here's what actually happened. Long-term capital gains don't get their own separate calculation. They stack on top of your ordinary income. And so for Tom and Linda, their ordinary income consisted of that pension, also the IRA withdrawals, and that had already filled up most of the 0% bracket. Now, they had $25,500 of room left, not $80,000 and not $98,900 either, which is the top of the 0% capital gains bracket for a married couple filing jointly in 2026. So the first $25,500 of that gain, 0%, no tax, just like they had expected. But the remaining $54,500, that got pushed into the 15% bracket. 15% on $54,500 is $8,175 in federal tax alone on gains that they assumed would be completely tax-free. Now, not because they did anything wrong, not because they made a bad investment decision. It was really just because they didn't fully understand how this works. And so if you're retired or if you're close to it, and if you have a taxable brokerage account, there's a good chance you're one decision away from the same type of surprise, unless you understand how this works. And by the way, if we haven't met yet, I'm Ryan Kravitz. I'm a certified financial planner, and I help people transition into and through retirement. All right, so let's take a look at how capital gains actually work, and then we'll take a look at some options that Tom and Linda could have considered. So many people think about their tax bracket as just one thing, right? I mean, if you're in the 12% tax bracket, for example, you pay 12%, at least on your last dollar of income, since we have that marginal tax rate system. Simple enough, right? But that's not actually how it works when you have long-term capital gains. These are actually two separate rate schedules that are running at the same time. So you've got one for ordinary income like pension and IRA withdrawals and also the taxable portion of your Social Security. And that's all taxed at your regular bracket rates. And then you have one for long-term capital gains and qualified dividends, which is taxed at either 0, 15, or 20%. It all depends on where your total income lands. The key word is total, because capital gains don't just get their own lane. They stack on top of everything else that you've already earned that year. And so here's how those rates break down for 2026. For a married couple filing jointly, 0% on gains up to $98,900 in taxable income, and then 15% from there, and then up to $613,700. So these are the lines you can see here. And by the way, everything I'm covering here is federal tax only. So if you live in a state with an income tax, then your state will likely have its own treatment of capital gains on top of this. And so if you run the numbers, you got the pension, the IRA withdrawal, subtract the standard deduction, and then their taxable income comes out to $73,400. Well, the top of the 0% bracket is $98,900. So they had $25,500 of room, not $80,000. All right, so now let's talk about some options that perhaps they could have considered instead here. And by the way, to be clear, selling those investments, it might have been exactly the right move for them. I mean, maybe those positions had run their course. I mean, maybe it was time for them to rebalance. And sometimes it absolutely makes sense to sell even if there's a tax bill, because holding on to an investment just to avoid taxes, that's not a strategy either. I mean, a position that keeps dropping in value doesn't get better just because selling it would be more tax efficient, right? So the problem for Tom and Linda wasn't that they sold. That's not it at all. It was just that they had made the investment decision without fully understanding the tax consequences of how all this works. So let's look at what the options actually were. I mean, they had $25,500 of room in the 0% capital gains bracket, and they had $80,000 in gains to realize. Now, option one is don't realize the full gain in a single year. Right? Sell only what fits inside the 0% bracket this year. And so in their case, again, it was $25,500. And then what they could do is spread the rest across maybe 2 or 3 years, intentionally trying to capture a portion tax-free each time that they sold. Option two is just to realize the full gain this year anyway. I mean, maybe the investment decision outweighs the tax cost, but the key thing here is just to do it with eyes open and make sure that you understand the tax implications. Now, option three, and this one surprises some people. So instead of selling the appreciated investments this year, use that bracket room to do a Roth conversion at 12%. So here's the trade-off. A Roth conversion is ordinary income. So if you do a meaningful one, it will fill up the bracket and then reduce your capital gains room at the same time. So you're essentially choosing to either realize capital gains at 0%, or to move money into tax-free growth at 12%. For some people, the Roth conversion is actually more valuable long-term. The capital gain can wait perhaps, but the Roth conversion window might not, especially in those early retirement years before Social Security starts and while income is at its lowest. Now, option four is to pull less from the IRA this year and cover more of your living expenses from the brokerage account. So if you have less ordinary income, this means more room before hitting the 0% capital gain ceiling, which of course means more of the gain potentially falls in that 0% bracket. Now, none of these options exist in a vacuum. The right answer is it's not about whichever one saves you the most in taxes this year. Because as an example, if you defer your IRA withdrawals too long, well, that account keeps growing. And then when required minimum distributions kick in later on, then you may be forced to take out more than you need at perhaps higher tax rates, and whether you actually need all that income or not. So the real goal, it's not about minimizing taxes in any single year. It's really all about how to minimize your total tax bill across your entire retirement. And that requires looking at the full picture, not just today, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and beyond. And And that kind of multi-year view is really what turns a good tax year into a good retirement. And what makes this harder is that the numbers change every year. I mean, the year before Social Security starts looks very different from the year that it starts. And then once you're receiving Social Security and then also R&Ds begin on top of that, well, then you have multiple income streams that you can't control stacking up at the same time. And then this can leave you with far less flexibility than you had in those earlier retirement years. Every income decision shifts the math. And if you're not looking at the full picture before you act, then you might find out the consequences in April when it's unfortunately too late to change it. And that was the case with Tom and Linda. It's not like they could go back and unsell the stocks and the ETFs. I mean, the gain was realized, the tax was owed. But what they could do, going forward anyways, was to make sure that they never made another financial move without running the numbers first. And really, it's about understanding what those numbers are that need to be run. The 0% capital gains rate is real. And for a lot of retirees, there's going to be a lot of good opportunities where it is available. But it's not automatic. I mean, it doesn't apply to your whole gain, just because your income feels low. It applies to the room that's left in your bracket after everything else has been counted. And if you're pulling from an IRA to cover living expenses, the way that a lot of retirees do, well, that room is probably smaller than you think. Knowing that number before you sell, and before you rebalance, before you make any moves that trigger a gain, that's what separates a retirement where taxes work in your favor from one that keeps producing surprises in April. This is worth paying attention to, because the goal isn't to just understand the tax rules. It's to know your numbers before you move. If this resonates with you and you'd like to learn more about how I work with people, I've added a link below where you can get started. I want to thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.